To all of you here, and to the two people who may ever at some time watch this, greetings. Those who have listened to me over the last few years may have noticed the prevalence of the word call. Calls luring, calls interrupting, calls but barely heard. This prevalence is a hope, possibly a delusion, that something is astir within life. Something laying itself upon us, laying upon hearts and minds, something often named as God, at times love, justice, hospitality, freedom. If call is astir, a question comes to mind. Is hearing a call the same as receiving a call? Perhaps backing into the question, the call of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible passage, as written, stands as an evocative, perhaps troublesome, expression of an intensely personal experience. The initiation of the prophet's Isaiah's work. Yet while Isaiah's call may stir something within us, the manner in which this passage is appropriated, the way its lines are hijacked, if I'm not making too fine a point, perhaps being way too cranky, is appalling for any gifted, perhaps cursed, with the ability to detect BS. Truthfully, I have received if I have received one ordination invitation with the line, "Whom shall I send? Here I am, send me." I've received far too many. And when I've received them, my gag reflex kicks in and creative utterance breaks forth. Thankfully, the overwhelming piety, pomposity, and arrogance of these kind of invitations is undercut by the context of the passage. The substance of Isaiah's call, Isaiah's commission, and a personal comment, I mean, come on, let's be honest. Who wants that call? The substance of his call is to tell people that they don't get it, that they don't want to get it, that their stopped up ears, their blinded eyes, their confused minds will lead to their destruction, their desolation. Do I hear ordination candidates rushing for the doors? If you think about it, and I pray you do, Isaiah's call isn't necessarily good news. So be careful. Please be careful what you pray for. You may get it. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes an argument regarding resurrection. Stirring within the example of his call, is Paul's, quote-unquote, resurrection. And I pray you listen. As one untimely born, one as good as dead, one least unfit, a call is heard, changing, disturbing, one murderous in their persecution, calling Paul into an unknown of new sight and new mind. Paul, in pointing to his call, or at least stirring within the call, says, if one so oppositional, so impossible in persecutorial zeal can respond to a call overwhelming yet barely understood, changing his life so unexpectedly, so completely, that within call, resurrection, new life is astir. Is not new life possible for all? If in response, Paul is born over from above, born again, and again, I pray you listen to this. Is he not implicitly saying, if I may paraphrase, God's call comes to all, even those, perhaps especially those, whose previous experience, personal qualities, character traits, abilities, inabilities, would seem to render them incompatible, beyond the pale, absolutely ruled out. Perhaps it is true. Ordinands and those righteous, beware. Perhaps it is true that God's thoughts are not our thoughts. Implicit, even in Paul's story, is a certain unknowing about calls. The calls which trouble us, intrude upon us, stirring heart, mind, and soul, a certain walking into an unknown future, calls rarely having the specificity of Isaiah's call. Isaiah's call, which, if it needs to be said, is not beyond exegetical comment and a certain deconstructive hermeneutic. Call, truth to tell, is so uncertain in its hearing, so confusing, is it ever otherwise? That it suggests, perhaps, that the more certain the call, the more certain the overlay getting in the way. An overlay personal, corporate, ecclesial, obscuring, obfuscating, still, small voices. To put it very simply, the more certain you are of your call, the more certain you've probably screwed it up. Turning to the gospel, admittedly, this gospel story evokes images, memories of many a stained glass window, themes within evoking expectations of abundance, lines within evoking assumptions of success. Within the call of Simon Peter, James, and John, Andrew is unnamed, yet appearing in other versions of the story, is a call to do what Jesus says. Or if I may be so wild, a missional call to respond to the question, what would Jesus do? While this question brings to mind bracelets made popular by the religious right, and again another personal comment, my God, I found those bracelets and those who wore them annoying. But within the question, WWJD is a distant echo of the social justice context of the original 1896 book, In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? By Charles Sheldon. This book speaks a justice call, evoking the madness of the kingdom of God, the madness of justice of hospitality extended, of reconciliation with those other. Stirring within this question, WWJD, is the following. What Jesus do we hear? Do we hear the Jesus of cultural conformity, the God of confessional purity? Do we hear a dusty muted, prophetic voice of one often talked about, yet little understood. One whose voice is but others' memories, others' voices. One who, if you listen carefully, very carefully, perhaps speaks within words, stirring new hearts and new minds, stirring surprising acts of compassion, justice, and hospitality. Do we hear, stirring within, a call to us? What do we do? What will we do? Do we risk response? Risking more than we can ask or imagine? Do we risk transformative moments, change taking us where no one has gone before? You got to work in a Star Trek reference. Do we risk hearing that which we have not heard? Risk doing that which we have not done? Risking the loss of certainty, risking the advent of complexity, risking Spirit's movement. Time, as always, will tell. In the end, how do we answer the question earlier posed? Is hearing a call the same as receiving a call? Truth to tell, perhaps answers are unknowable, or knowable only in the response, in the living, in the risking. In the end, hearing a call, perhaps better, sensing a call, are we willing to speak of that call? Are we willing to listen to others in response to our speech, risking a call within a call? Sensing a call, are we willing to risk response? Perhaps a response greater than we can ask or imagine. As I said, time, as always, will tell. And finally, a quote from John Caputo, in which he talks about Charles Sheldon's book, In His Steps, and actually quotes from it. In the opening chapter of In His Steps by Charles Sheldon, a homeless man in his early 30s disturbs the decorum of the Sunday morning services of the First Church of Raymond, the most proper and prosperous church in town. The choir had given a particularly excellent rendition of Jesus, I my cross have taken, all to leave and follow thee. The pastor, the Reverend Henry Maxwell, had just concluded a stirring sermon on 1 Peter 2:21. For hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that ye shall follow in his steps. Then, at just the precise moment, the bedraggled young man comes forward and addresses a startled congregation. I'm not an ordinary tramp, though I don't know of any teaching of Jesus that makes one kind of a tramp less worthy of saving than another. Do you? He put the question as naturally as if the whole congregation had been a small Bible class. He paused just a moment, coughed painfully, then he went on. He recounts a Dickenesque story of misfortune. He lost his job as a typesetter. His wife died in a desperate New York City tenement owned by Christians, and he can no longer care for his daughter, who now lives with a friend. After reporting his futile attempts to find help in their community, despite 3 days of trying, he concludes, "It seems to me there's an awful lot of trouble in the world that somehow wouldn't exist if all the people who sing such songs went and lived them out. I suppose I don't understand, but what would Jesus do?" Then he gives a queer lurch and falls in a heap on the church floor. A doctor rushes to his side and reports, "He seems to have a heart problem." A heart problem? Really? I wonder who has the heart problem.